This morning we're going to be continuing our series through the book of Esther, so you can make your way over there. We'll be wrapping up a couple of verses from Esther chapter 5 and then tearing through the rest of Esther chapter 6 this morning. Consistent with my introduction throughout this series, I've been sharing little pieces of information with you about Uncle Rudy. He was my uncle, Lieutenant Colonel in the Air Force, patrolling the no-fly zone in northern Iraq. And this morning, the connection, as I was hearing him share about his experience on his missions, the connection fits in well with God's timing. When Uncle Rudy, kind of in charge of laying out schedule and mission layouts for the men who were flying in their F-16s, when he would lay all this out, he had to hold to a pretty strict schedule. And the reason for that was the F-16s, as they would fly out, they only had enough fuel to get them about a quarter of the way across the no-fly zone, which meant every so often they had to refuel. So they had these great big, and Bob Brown was talking to me the other day. He mentioned the name of the planes. I can't remember what kind of plane it was. But Bob used to work on these planes when he was in the Air Force. These planes would fly way up in the air, and the jets would come in underneath these planes, and they'd have this long hose, this long tube, that would come down to refuel the jets. And there's all kinds of crazy, cool stuff in connection with how they would refuel. And Bob was saying there was actually a guy, his job was to lay down on his belly and navigate that pole to the right spot on the jets. I'd imagine that to be kind of a crazy thing. I hope he doesn't mind me sharing this. I thought this was funny. When I was talking to him about it the other day, he said, yeah, there's a guy, you can have a job where you lay on your belly all day and pass gas. You get paid to do that. But from what Uncle Rudy had explained in regards to this, every 5 minutes, there was a new jet coming in for refuel. Every 5 minutes. Which meant they did not have a lot of time to waste. They had to get in, get full, and get gone. And if that rotation got messed up, I mean, they had it down to a science. How much fuel was in each jet to get them from point A to point B before they would have to refuel? It could mess things up pretty badly. Timing was everything. As we continue our study through Esther today, we're going to be learning about timing. We're going to be learning about how God's timetable does not always match with the timetable that we imagine to be best. We've all experienced times in our lives where we've thought we've had it figured out, exactly what God is doing, only for Him to change what's happening. I'm going to open us in prayer, and then we're going to see what happened for Esther, what change took place for Esther, and how according to God's timetable, when He stepped in and intervened, it worked out perfectly. Let me open us in prayer. Father God, You are very good. God, we desperately need You. Our wisdom only takes us so far. It only comes from You. It comes from Your word. It comes from Your walking with us, Your shepherding us, Your teaching us. So God, this morning we open our hearts to You, for You to teach us. Use Your word to transform us. God, help us to learn from Esther and from Mordecai and from Haman how awesome You are. We pray this in the name of Christ. Amen. So I'm going to start with a few verses from Esther chapter 5, then jump to Esther 6, read through it all, and I'll explain why I'm doing it that way in a moment. Esther chapter 5, starting in verse 6. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Now Esther chapter 6, starting in verse 1. On that night the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who had guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." And the king said, Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends and everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." Verse 14, while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. This is quite the turn of events from where we left off last week. Last week we looked at Esther's preparation, we looked at God's provision, we looked at Haman's pride. The chapter left off last week with Haman going home, and he was all kinds of angry and upset and just rage-filled. Because when he left this banquet with the king and the queen, he was on, seventh heaven, cloud nine, whatever, happy emotion you could imagine. But as he's walking out from that, he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai does not bow down. Mordecai does not acknowledge him with respect, and Haman had a complete pendulum shift of emotions. He went from ecstatic to angry and wrath-filled. And he goes home and he complains to his wife and his friends. He kind of throws a party, but it was a really big pity party. And in that party, he's announcing all of his wonderful accomplishments and says that none of this matters so long as Mordecai does not bow down to him. So his wife and his friends, they give him this counsel of just hang the guy. Kill him, be done with it, and then go about your merry way. Don't worry about it. This is what Haman thought was going to happen when he went before the king that day. Now, last week when we talked about Esther's preparation, we talked about how the entire people of Israel were praying and fasting, and she was praying and fasting. They were seeking the face of God of, what do we do here? Give me wisdom as I go before the king. And though she had prepared well, God's timing wasn't yet right. See, I believe that God took the words right out of Esther's mouth. I want to read those verses for you again, and this is your first point in your outline. There were no words. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said, "Esther, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even a half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is," the moment she prepared for, The moment the people of Israel had been praying for and fasting for, it was here. She's ready to present her request. And before she can get the words out of her mouth, they're gone. See, I don't think that this was part of her plan. When she went before the king and invited the king to the feast, she had prepared, is what the text says. The feast is already set. But now, when she presents this request, I think as she's kind of fumbling through, oh no, now I don't have the confidence, I don't have the courage, I don't have the words, she says, if you're willing to hear it, then come to the feast that I will prepare. Not yet there. I will prepare this tomorrow. Can we do a redo for tomorrow? She says, my wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast. I will prepare for them. And tomorrow I will do as the king has said. Tomorrow I will ask. What do you think Esther's night was like? What do you think it was like for her going home after this feast that she had prepared, after 3 days of fasting, no food, no water, anguish in her heart, fear in her heart, not even sure if she was going to get to present her request? Was the king just going to strike her dead in the moment she stepped into the courtyard? And she has her moment, and she stutters. Stage fright, fear creeps in, whatever. God took the words from her. How do you think she felt when she went home that night? Well, if you guys have ever laid a plan before, and then the plan doesn't work out very well, usually there's not like, woohoo, yippee, yay. Usually there's maybe some sadness to it, some discouragement to it, maybe some frustration. I wonder if Esther went home and continued then fasting and praying through that night, asking God, what is wrong with me? Why could I not ask these words? Why could I not get it out there? How do you feel when you have what seems to be a perfect plan, and then it looks as though God changes the plan? What do you do when God changes the plan? Do you let fear rule you? Do you try to just come up with plan B? Scurry, scrounge, come up with the best that you can? Or do you go before your God and do you pray? Do you trust him? Do you ask him to intervene? Do you say, okay, God, I'm going to step back. I'm going to trust that you're going to lead here. And I'm not going to act. See, I think Esther, in her moment where the words were taken out of her mouth, I think as God took those words out of her mouth, there was also some wisdom that God granted her in the moment that said, can we pick this up tomorrow? I think that was a God's grace thing. See, though Esther had prepared and though she had this plan all set out, and it was a godly plan, she was going to do something great, something courageous, something noble, something worthy. God was not finished laying the foundation. And God wanted more time so he could set the stage perfectly. Which brings you to your next point. No sleep. On that night, the king could not sleep. Chapter 6, verse 1, and he gave the orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. All right, so the king, right? Remember, this guy he is a party man. He likes happiness all around him. He does not want sadness around him. Mordecai could not cross the threshold in his sackcloth and ashes because the king would have had him put to death, right? You remember that from just a couple of weeks ago. In Mordecai's grieving, though he was an official of the king, he could not bring that sadness before the king, anywhere near him. This king surrounded himself with happiness and joy and warm feelings, and I picture like fresh cut flowers and butterflies flying around his room or something. This guy just loved happiness. Why would he have a sleepless night? What did he have to lose sleep over? He's well insulated. Yet the evil cannot rest when God is in control, and he has a sleepless night. So what does he do? I need somebody just to go get me like the most boring book ever. You guys ever, like, I remember when I was a little kid, I don't really watch much TV now, but when I was a little kid, I would always like watch TV and look for something fun, like in the middle of the night, like maybe something scary or high action and adventure. And what's the channel that always sells stuff? What is it? QVC. I was going to say PCP, but that is not what I was watching. The QVC. That stuff is boring. Like, I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody who's like, but that's my favorite pastime. Like, that stuff will put you to sleep, right? And you wake up and they were selling Tupperware, and then you wake up and they've got like, you need these 150 pocket knives. And like, but it's boring stuff. The king was looking for something boring, something that was going to lull him to sleep, distract him from whatever was going through his mind. And so he pulls out memorable deeds, the Chronicles. That would be like going back to, 1956, the business minutes for Midway. Does anybody want to go back to 1956 and read the minutes for Midway? I'm sure we have them. I think they're stored up behind there somewhere. We have them somewhere, but if you really want to read them, but that's like boring stuff. It's not pertinent to this day. Well, what the king didn't know was in choosing a random boring book, and when whomever decided what page to flip open to, and okay, we'll read this one, landed on an event that happened about 4 years prior to, where the king's life was saved. We've already studied that text. We did that just a handful of weeks ago, where there were two eunuchs who were upset with the king for whatever reason, and they were planning to assassinate King Ahasuerus. But Mordecai overheard the plan. He overheard this plot, and he intervened. He used his influence to change the course of action. Those two men ended up dying. Mordecai continued his job, and nothing else is said of that. And it seemed kind of oddly placed in the beginning of the book of Esther until now. Roughly 4 years after that event, the king on a sleepless night turns to the most boring book he can find, and that's the story that was read to him. How Mordecai used his influence and saved the king's life. I think it's interesting that the king says, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? This evil king who was all about himself, insulating himself from danger, from stress, from anything upsetting, living the high life, living selfishly. Even he knew how to show honor and respect. And he says, what was done to honor this man? And the young men who were reading to him said, well, honestly, king, nothing. The king's like, I can't stand for this. Something's got to be done. So the king, I'm picturing this, right? I'm picturing we're in a bedroom setting, right? Because he couldn't sleep. His hope was not to stay up all night. His hope was to have a boring book read to him so he would fall asleep. I don't think he was sitting in his lazy boy, and I don't think he was walking his balcony. I think he was probably laying in bed, waiting to fall back asleep. This story's read to him. He sits up. He's like, nothing was done to honor this guy? We got to come up with a plan. How are we going to honor this man? And so he says, who's in the court? Who's here? Who's up in the middle of the night? Who is walking the courtroom of my kingdom at, I don't know, maybe 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, 6 in the morning? Well, none other than the evil Haman. And the awesome thing here is that as God was structuring the perfect timing, Esther has no words, and the king has no sleep, and the prideful, haughty, arrogant, self-righteous, conniving, evil Haman steps back into the picture. And Haman had no glory. Point 3 in your outline. The king had said, who's here? Haman is here. So the king says, bring him here. Send him in. Now, imagine what might be going through Haman's mind. He just had this party with the king and queen the day before. He sees Mordecai. He's angry. He goes home, throws a party for himself. His wife and his friends say, you just gotta hang the guy. He's like, I love this plan. He erects a 75-foot pole. I'm believing it to be a pole because that was customary with their culture. It could very well have been a beam, and he put a rope there, but more than likely it was a pole. He erects a 75-foot pole so he can elevate Mordecai. He can assuage his own pride and put Mordecai up for everybody to see in a shameful, disgraceful death. And the plan is, first thing in the morning, before any other business is conducted, I'm going to go and present my request to the king. Haman would have had no idea that the king had a sleepless night. He would have had no idea that the king was reading about the chronicles of how Mordecai, the Jew, had saved his life. And that the king was going to have a change of heart where his focus was not going to be on himself for a brief moment of history, and it was going to be about honoring and esteeming somebody else. Haman had no idea. So I think when Haman walked into that inner court, he's thinking, this is going to be a good day. This is going to be awesome. I'm going to hang my enemy. I'm going to go do lunch with the king and queen. I'm going to be honored. It's going to be wonderful, awesome, spectacular. So when the king says, who's here? Who's in the inner court at this really weird, strange hour? Haman's here. Send him in. Bring him to my bedroom. And Haman's like, I mean, for somebody to go before the king, the golden scepter had to be extended. You remember that for Esther. She was terrified she was going to die because the king had not called her. What if he didn't extend the golden scepter? That's one thing, but to be invited into his bedroom, whew, I think Haman is probably like, I am the stuff. This is great. So he goes before the king, right? And the king asks a question. What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And the text says it. It says, and Haman said to himself, who would the king delight to honor more than me? Wow, the arrogance. This guy thought really well of himself. So because he's thinking so highly of himself, he crafts this master plan. He puts out there, here's how I would want to be honored. Here's how I want to be viewed. Here's how I want to be seen. I want to be treated this way. He plans his own party again. So he says, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn. I'm thinking that probably never happened. The king probably didn't donate to Goodwill very often. And the horse that the king has ridden. Like, there's a problem with, like, when you're a monarch and you let other people, like, ride your horse. You don't know what people are going to do to your horse, hoping that you might fall and die. There's a trust issue here. Haman says, the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown is set. You get any ideas here of what Haman's true aspirations were? A royal crown set on his head. I recently watched the new Disney live action of Aladdin. I had never seen the cartoon version before because my childhood was very different than the average child who enjoyed watching cartoons. I was watching like horror films. So Aladdin came out, I'd never seen it until I saw it recently. And I was introduced to this character named Jafar. And he was a vizier appointed by the king, I guess, and I don't know, he must have been a counselor to the king or whatever. But he makes this interesting statement in the beginning of the movie, and it's reminded at the end of the movie that if you're not the most powerful person in the room, you're nothing at all. Now that showed the heart of Jafar. I'm not quoting Jafar and elevating it to that of Scripture. However, I think that that's what's in the heart of Haman. I think Haman is thinking, I got to be most powerful. I'm not done climbing this corporate ladder yet. There's one more rung. So when he's putting together his plan of how is this guy that the king delights to honor going to be honored, he says, put a crown on his head. And then, this is amazing, God is awesome. And then, right, let the robes and the horse be handed over to the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before them, this is what is to be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Well, Haman was the most noble man in the kingdom, aside from the king. So I don't know who he had in mind that was going to do this. Maybe there were some other little peons underneath him in the kingdom, and he's like, they're going to learn a lesson too. They're going to honor me. Failing to realize this was not about him to begin with. So when he presents this plan to the king is like, Haman, my man, you are so right. This is a great plan. Here are the robes. Here's the horse. There's Mordecai. Get to work. Oh, man, like, I can't imagine that nasty, sinking, awful feeling that Haman must have experienced. I don't care. Like, I don't have sympathy for the guy. But that devastation when the king said, you're going to be the guy to usher Mordecai through the streets. You'll notice that when the king gives the instruction in verse 10, he says, and the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. Why is it significant that the king said Mordecai the Jew? Well, I'm glad you asked. It's significant because Haman had already devised a horrible, evil plan to exterminate the Jews. The king doesn't seem to draw any connections at this point. Haman wants the Jews dead, Mordecai's a Jew, Haman hates Mordecai. Oh, there's something fishy going on. The king is so well insulated, I think, that he's not firing on all cylinders. Or maybe he's just groggy because it's still early in the morning. But he identifies Mordecai as the Jew. He says, you're going to do all this to Mordecai the Jew. Now, I'm thinking at this point in time, there's a good possibility Haman so caught up in himself, so caught up in the details of his own glory and his own honor, and getting this sucker punch to the gut, maybe he's winded, and he's not yet thinking about how his plan to exterminate the Jews is at risk. Or maybe he is. Maybe he's starting to realize his plan is falling apart. That there's some absolutely crazy coincidental circumstances happening around him. And he'd have to call it that because he never identified Jehovah as his God. See, as Christians, we don't have crazy coincidental circumstances that happen in our lives. We have a God who absolutely, perfectly orchestrates things in our lives. So Haman starts ushering Mordecai through the streets. And I'm just thinking, I'm just imagining, when Haman told the king, here's what that noble is to say. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. I think when he was laying the plan out to the king, it was with exuberance, with vigor, with praise. And as Haman is ushering Mordecai through the streets, I'm thinking maybe he wasn't saying it quite so energetically. I'm picturing him saying, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Because why would he want to honor his enemy, Mordecai, the relative of Saul who hacked up his ancestors? Well, actually, Saul didn't hack up the ancestors. Samuel had to do it. But you get the point. There was deep-rooted bitterness between the families for so long. And now Haman has to honor this guy. There's a couple passages from Proverbs that come to mind. Proverbs 27, 1 and 2 says, do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring. Haman had no idea what that morning was going to look like. Verse 2, let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips. Haman crafted the opportunity for him to receive praise, for him to receive glory. Proverbs 18:12 says, before destruction, a man's heart is haughty, but humility comes before honor. So what happens after this parade? What would be very reminiscent of a celebration of a coronation. Afterwards, what happens? Well, the text says in verse 12, then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. That's kind of telling, isn't it? I don't think this entire thing mattered to Mordecai. Receiving praise from his enemy, false praise from his enemy, didn't mean anything to Mordecai. And I don't think Mordecai saved the king's life so that someday he would be honored and paraded through a street. I think he did what was right because it was right, not so that others would praise him for it. So Haman, the evil Haman, would have taken great joy and received glory for this whole thing. And Mordecai's like, I got nothing on this. Can I get off this horse? I just want to go back to work. That's humility. But Haman acts how Mordecai acted when he learned of the plot to kill the Jews. Remember, Mordecai put on sackcloth and ashes, and he's going through the streets, and he's wailing, he's grieving, he's crying out to his God in repentance for himself and for his people, and he's beseeching God, please do something to change this. He was mourning. What does Haman go home to do? To mourn with his head covered. What was he mourning? It was the death of his pride. He lost something great. All these people in the streets that he wanted to have their respect, that needed to bow down or face the wrath of Haman, they had to watch him elevate his enemy. He no longer had the respect of those people. Imagine the humiliation that he's thinking through of what the rest of this day is supposed to look like now. It was going to be a good day. The guy that got elevated on the horse to be praised in the streets was supposed to be elevated on a pole and disgraced in the streets. Oh, how the tides had turned. And this builds up to your last blank there in your outline, which is no time. See, Haman was a schemer. Haman was a planner. He was conniving. He worked in the shadows. He was a whisperer. He went home to mourn, cover his head. Apparently he must have gathered his friends again. Verse 13 says, and Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. He went home looking for a pity party, kind of like what he had had the night before when Mordecai would not bow down to him as he was leaving the feast with the king and queen. And these wise people, who were not very wise at the very end of chapter 5, who said, just hang the guy, go joyfully to your feast. All of a sudden, God spoke through the mouth of fools. I think God was prophesying in a way through the mouth of these fools, because they said, if Mordecai, whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him. Even those surrounding him recognized, yo, dude, this is bad. Like, you might want to start taking that pole down. Your plan is probably not going to work out. What they didn't say, because I don't think they identified Jehovah as their God, was you will not overcome Jehovah. You will not foil God's plan. There's nothing you're going to be able to do. All your scheming, all your evil, all your conniving, all your pride will never overcome the plan of God. That's what they didn't say, but they kind of said it without saying it. In verse 14, while they were yet talking with him, he's not monologuing, they're talking with him. While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. He was out of time. He couldn't plan. He couldn't scheme. He couldn't figure out a way to talk his way out of the circumstances before the king's eunuchs arrived to say, hey, remember that awesome thing you were so excited about yesterday that you get to go before the king and the queen and have another feast with them? Yeah, that time is now. Thinking he's not in a partying mood. But he cannot refuse the king. And more so than not being able to refuse his king, he could not refuse God. He had no time left. So go back again in your mind to Esther, who had no words. She's prepared to give her request before the king. It's like God just took the words right out of her mouth. See, at that time, I think Esther, she could have gone back to her room that night, and she could have said, God, I don't understand. What are you doing? My people are going to die. Your people are going to die. I was prepared. I was ready to lay my life down. I was ready to serve. And you took it away. You took the words away. Why? But what she didn't know was God was working in the details. God was not yet done setting the stage. God is God, and he is good, and he is huge, and he will always take care of his people. As that story continues to unfold, we're going to pick it back up in 2 weeks. Ron Dudek is preaching next week. I'll pick up the series again in 2 weeks. We're going to see exactly what God was doing and exactly how he took care of his people in an incredible way that only God could do. But I want to close you with some questions for you to consider. What do you do when the plans seem to change? How do you respond? Do you get angry with God? Well, God, I had it all worked out. Do you sulk? Do you throw a pity party? Soak into a depression because you're not getting what you wanted, failing to realize that even in not getting what you wanted, maybe it wasn't what was best. Maybe God's got something better in mind. Can I encourage you, the way that we need to respond when the timing doesn't seem right to us is to trust God. Say, God, we recognize you're going to take care, you're in control. You're going to lead however you think is best. We will trust you. We will follow. That's how we need to respond. Let me close this in prayer. Father God, you are awesome. We praise you for how good you are. We praise you that even when things don't make sense to us, you have a plan. You have a purpose. And your plan and purpose is not always to make us happy, but to make us joyful. Recognizing that even in misery, even in sorrow, even in pain, the loss of a job, the loss of a loved one, the loss of health, God, that you work in the details. And when the timing doesn't seem right to us, that does not mean the timing is wrong. It means that we need to adjust and we need to trust. And I pray that you will help us to do that faithfully, consistently. You have demonstrated unbelievable faithfulness for your people for